All right, welcome everybody back to another episode of the Big Douglas Show. It is a Friday, so you know that we are going inside the command center. To get us there, we invited two of my favorites, Craig Hoffman and Logan Paulsen. Fellas, how are you?
Good, Doug.
Doing good, man. Thanks.
We've had you on separately, but I don't think we've ever. I know I haven't had you on at the same time, representing all sides of the Take Command podcast. Craig, how did the podcast come about? You guys, this is year two for you guys.
Yeah, it's year two. Our bosses, or my bosses, asked us to do it, and they offered Logan a spot on it. He said yes. That's how the podcast came together. By the way, I do think this is the first time we've ever done a hit on another podcast together. So history was made right here.
I didn't do a ton of research, but I'm fairly certain it hasn't been done before.
Yeah.
Big Doug
I
brings
mean,
you the very best. We bring you the very best here.
The slightly longer answer is at the time I was still part-time. I didn't have the radio show at the time, and our parent company Odyssey was launching this podcast series, which they hoped to eventually be around the NFL, which eventually it got to. They decided that some of the audiences weren't really clicking great, so we have most NFL markets covered, but I was kind of the logical person to host it because I was a kind of a free agent or in between the Spirit and the full-time radio show. And I know we've talked about that career path on the show before for me. But being a former beat reporter and having a digital presence, I was kind of the logical person to play my role on it. And obviously Logan had started doing stuff with the station, and I think little did we know at the time that a couple weeks later they'd also asked us to do pregame together for the first time. So that was kind of the first main thing that we did together was like the podcast and pregame in that first year, and then wrap around. We were year two. Here we are. I've got the daily radio show. Logan's role has expanded with the media stuff he does, and we're still doing pregame. So that's where we are.
Logan, are you surprised that Craig said he was the logical choice for the job?
I mean, it's funny because the way I remember it is I remember we had talked about doing a podcast, kind of the two of us together independently. And we had brought that to CK, our boss, and he was kind of like, yeah, when this opportunity came up, he was like, let's do that. So, I think, Craig and I get along well. He's got good insight. He's great at what he does in terms of hosting the show. And I think, everyone should tune into his main show on the radio station to check that out. But he does a great job on our show. And so, yeah, in some ways it feels logical. Like he was hungry. He was passionate. He loves talking football. So, yeah, I'd say logical from that standpoint, 100%.
I'm just bad at remembering things. You're right, Logan. I have my years off. What happened was in 2021, we did pregame before the podcast ever existed.
Right.
We had done. I knew there was something. We did they did like a training camp show, and that was the first thing we did together, which was like a very limited series podcast type of thing. And then we did pregame together, and we had these incredible conversations in the commercial breaks. And I was like, "This is the podcast." And so we pitched that, and then the company did the thing, and CK was finally like, "Here's a home for it. Go do your podcast."
Right.
And that's actually how it was born. So sorry for the misdirection on my first answer.
Logan, you played for a couple of teams. I'm curious how you ended up back with Washington as kind of where you made your new home and dug into your second career kind of.
Yeah, well, I think, when I was playing in the latter half of my career, I was kind of with a different team every year. And so obviously, before I moved out, from Washington, before I was cut and went to the Bears, we bought a house here. And when my son was just born, and he was about 2 when I got cut here. My wife was pregnant. So for that year, it kind of made sense to stick around. Like all of our friends were here, our doctors, daycares, all these things that kind of support a family were here. So she stayed for that year. We tried the San Francisco, moving out there. That was my 7th year moving out to San Francisco. And that just didn't work out. It was just too up and down. It was too stressful for my wife. It was just a big lift for the family. And so we kind of said, for the next couple of years while I'm still playing, this will be home base. And so it just made sense because I'd come back here in the off seasons every year to kind of work that out. And so I remember having a conversation with Grant Paulsen when I was in Houston about doing some XFL stuff. And I said, we'll see how this season goes. And that ended up being my last year. So I did the XFL thing, and it just kind of, I won't say organically happened that there was a good opportunity here for me with the local media. Like my name still had, it's never going to have the same pull as like a Smoot or a Tana because of my playing career here was so different than their experience. But, it just kind of led to some opportunities. I met CK, who again is our boss, through doing the XFL stuff. And then he kind of said, you want to do the pre and post game show? I did that. And Julie heard that on the radio and was like, we should get this guy to do some stuff for us. And it just kind of parlayed into more opportunities. So it just was a very natural thing for me to do, to kind of stick around, and we love the area too, my wife and I. So it was very natural for us.
Now, if you'd have been at one of those other stops and that team had, say, won a Super Bowl, you think it's more likely that you stick with one of those teams? Because I was thinking Chris Long comes on the podcast a bunch, and he spent most of his time with the Rams. They won the Super Bowl with the Eagles, and he's pretty much, taking
Yeah.
an Eagles affiliation route. Do you think that how does that work necessarily? It's just random on how that works, you think?
I think it's random. I think it's how the guys feel about the city they're a part of. Like I think Peyton. I always associate Peyton Manning as being a Indianapolis Colt, but he was just inducted into the Broncos Hall of Fame or Ring of Fame or whatever they were doing. And I think it just depends on how the city and how the team kind of resonates with you. And I know like there are guys that play in an area for a short time, but that place feels like home. And I think a really good example of that was like my time with the Falcons was really, really special. Like, love the guys, love the community, love the coaching staff, and that place kind of felt like the second home for me. All the other spots felt like pit stops, kind of. Chicago. I met one of my best friends in the NFL in Chicago, but just I knew that was going to be a temporary thing. San Francisco, very early on, felt like a temporary thing. Atlanta felt like another opportunity. So if that had gone a little bit differently, maybe I would have made a decision to kind of stick around there or do something there. But Washington always felt like the natural fit, because this is home for me and my family. So it was very, very easy for me.
All right, Craig, it's crazy to say this, but we're pretty much like at the third way point here in the season. It doesn't feel like we're all that way through. We spent all this time getting ready for the season, then it's all gone. Where are you with the progress of the team? I think franchise is too broad because we know there's so much going to happen there. But just as far as like what's going on in the field, where are you now at about a third way through the season?
Can't wait to hear this answer. What do you got, Craig?
I mean, it's weird because it's like how where they are record wise. If you just put like the resume up of they are 2-3 through 5 games, they're kind of on track with where we thought they'd be. Maybe you thought they'd be a little bit better, but I mean, I said I thought they'd win somewhere between 7 and 10 games, largely dependent on health. And instead, their but like how they've gotten here is nuts. Like their defense is on a literally historically bad run, and I don't think anyone saw that coming. Even if you thought they might start a little slow and have some adjustment processes, like they can't possibly be giving up 30 a game through 5 games for the 4th straight year, can they? Sure can. And meanwhile, I would say the offense has been kind of what I thought it would be. Like I actually thought this offense had a lot of potential with the skill position guys. I liked what I saw early enough from Sam and trusted EB to put him in good enough positions to get some point production. And so, yeah, I mean, they're kind of where I thought they would be. The path to get here, I think, is kind of bizarre. But I would say like on this is somewhere between this team and the franchise, like the football operation. Like I would say I have some clarity on things that need to happen in the future. We've talked about it. Like there's obviously a lot of fans that want to see firings right now. I think for a lot of logistical reasons, that's not very smart. But like I've kind of seen enough to know that we're probably headed in a different direction after the season. That could of course change. But you see some of the same problems year after year. Things don't really change year after year. And you feel like you're stuck on this hamster wheel. And I think that's kind of where I am right now is like, let's see what happens. I'm excited. There's a lot to talk about with young players and Sam and how does EB progress and what does that mean for the future? But like kind of where I thought they would be. And it's not that different from a lot of other years. And for that reason, it's probably going to lead to some stuff happening after the season.
I think we all kind of assume that stuff would happen after the season. I agree with you. There's no way that it can happen. It doesn't make any sense to do a lot of it in season. We talked about this a bunch recently on the podcast. Like you can fire Jack, but then who calls? I mean, has anybody on that staff called defensive plays? I don't think so, and I'm not really sure what it does.
No, the only guy on this, or the only 2 guys on payroll right now that have called NFL defensive plays are Ron Rivera and Juan Castillo. And Ron has not called them since 2018, and he's never called this defense. And Juan Castillo doesn't coach defense anymore.
Right. And as far as where we're at, I really think before the season started, like the Bears game, I thought they'd have and they didn't have. So I mean, and they're not that far off where I thought they'd be. Logan, you're smirking or half smiling. What is going on down there in your window?
That's what happens mostly when I'm talking.
Yeah, well, no, I think it's just like, I agree with what Craig says, and I agree with his analysis of the team. It's just, and I agree with his, like it's that what you said about the coaches. It's like who's gonna like fans are always calling for people to get fired, but who's gonna call the plays in the meantime, right? So those are things I always kind of smirk at because it just shows like just a limited understanding of how like a football ecosystem works in season. I think so. I think it's good that you brought that up. And then for me, I think it's kind of to Craig's point. Like I think the offense is played really well, and I've been really impressed with Sam, and there's a lot of optimism there. But I think on the flip side of that coin, like we talked about this on our show, like the defense has been largely disappointing, especially for a group that we thought was going to be so good coming out of training camp. So, like it's an interesting year, but I do think, like to Craig's point, like this is who we thought they were. Like this is like in terms of preseason evaluations, like this is where the roster was at. This is what's going on with them. So I didn't really feel like I think fans got their expectations very high after the wins that this team had, but I think they're kind of who we thought they would be. And the other thing I think that fans always kind of overlook is like I think that Philly game was very competitive, and I think that is something that if I'm looking as a coach, as an analyst, as a fan of the team, I say that thing is maybe like an iceberg of something better in the future for this team. So
But that's why everybody got so frustrated with the Bears here.
and I get it, and I think we've talked about this on the show, and I think I come across as an apologist a little bit, but I'm just trying to provide some context. Like obviously in the Bears game, they didn't play well, it's a short week, divisional game, emotions were high, road trip, all those things probably factor into kind of a lackluster performance. And then there are some like defensive decisions from a coaching staff perspective that you're like, that were a little bit surprising. And I'm not saying they're wrong, they just were kind of surprising. And I think all of those things factor into a game that I think a lot of people want back. And you can't do that in the NFL. But the thing is, you got some winnable games coming up here. And if you come up into like whatever the next third of the season and say, man, we come out 4-1, like the landscape of the year is totally different. So I think, again, I'm probably because I played, like I'm like, man, we still got a lot of football left to go. And I know that's what the message is in the building. And if they get some stuff corrected, like think about the Philly game. They're really like 4 plays away from being excellent and defensively and offensively in that game where we're talking about, wow, maybe the biggest upset in recent history, right? For this team. And that's great. But like it didn't go that way. So if they can get some of that stuff corrected, moving into these more competitive game environments, I think we could be talking very differently here in a couple of weeks. But that again is like a big character. That's another reason why I smile, because it's a big characteristic of this team historically, right? You're always like, what if this?
Right.
But it doesn't always happen that way. So
I mean, I think that's something that Logan and I talk about on our show a lot is like, having been a reporter and being in the room, like as a media person, I think I'm a lot closer to the player like mentality, because when you live it every day, like you kind of live the emotions of the people around you.
Right.
Now I'm in a talk show host, and the people around me are the callers into my show that are fans that are ticked. So it's like it's a different thing. But there are times where like I think as a player, and maybe it's like almost a subconscious survival mechanism. You're like, if we just can correct these couple of plays. 100%. And then you scale back as a media member or an analyst or a fan who's been living this for, a couple of years, 5 years, 10 years, 30, 40, 50 years as a fan. And you're like, that's how it always is. And you realize that's kind of the league is like the great teams make those plays. The mediocre teams make them sometimes, and the bad teams never make them. And so trying to figure out where they are. And sometimes being a mediocre team is more confusing because you're like, but they did it last week. And It's like, yeah, but they're not going to do it this week because they're mediocre, not great.
Look, one of the reasons it feels like the defense gets off to a slow start, and I know, Craig, we've had multiple conversations about why. And maybe it's because they have this, Jack has this weird deal where they play really well in zone. And yet he really wants to play aggressive man until they realize that the aggressive man doesn't work. Then they get back into a zone, it feels like, and the defense starts operating at a higher level. Now, maybe that's too simplistic, but it feels like we do that every year with Jack.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe even like strip it down a little bit more. I just think like one of the things when you're coaching and when you're playing is you think you in the preseason specifically, offensively, you think, this is what we're going to be good at. We're going to be good at X, Y, Z. And I said this on the show. But then you get into season, and for whatever reason, the stuff that was in the preseason, the stuff that was in training camp, it just doesn't click. Like the defense is a little bit faster. It doesn't give you the advantage you were hoping for. And all of a sudden you kind of say, we have to reevaluate. And I think some of that stuff happens on the defensive side of the football, because I think people don't understand how reactive defense is and how comprehensive that reaction can be. Like, everything the offense presents needs a solution. So for example, like let's say our coverage rules in man-to-man, or our coverage rules in cover 3 versus 3-by-1 are X in the offseason. And then all of a sudden someone's exploiting that rule through the season. It doesn't change immediately. It takes a couple games to kind of change that perspective and change that positioning. And obviously it's because you got to teach it, because you got to make sure that it's a fundamental flaw in how you're coaching it. So I do think that there is a learning process that takes place. And I think the fans, I think Craig was hoping that process would be expedited by the joint practices. And when I look at the overall performance of the defense, and I know I'm probably in the minority here, I think there are a lot of good things to take away, even in the 2 losses, right? I think when you look at the Bills game, like, that's a Super Bowl contending team. They offense turned the ball over 5 times, and they're going into the fourth quarter giving up 16 points to a very, very talented group offensively. Philly, I think outside of 4 explosive plays, like, they walk away with that game defensively. You can't always take away those variables, but I do think that context is important, that the defense, while it seems like it's on fire right now, and Craig always brings us up when we talk about this, well, there is that Broncos game, which I totally concur with. But I say in those 2 kind of big games against some of the best teams in football, the defensive performance was on the whole serviceable, outside of a couple things. And so that's what you're talking about really, is can you move the needle from, a 5 out of 10 to a 6 out of 10, 7 out of 10. And maybe that's changing from a man philosophy to a zone philosophy. Maybe that's just detailing stuff up, like we talked about on our podcast the other day. Like, maybe that's some subtle coaching things, but I think that's kind of what you're dealing with. And I think obviously the Bears game was terrible. And Santana said this to me the other day, like, that game's terrible and everyone's looking at that game. It's the most recent game. Like, that's become the identity of this group. But I actually think what the product you're going to get on the field is more similar to the competitive, aggressive, well-coached, or relatively well-coached groups that you saw in the Bills and the Philly game. And fans go, well, that was bad. But I don't think those games are bad defensively. I think they didn't perform as well as they could have. But I think that's the area of gray that I'm trying to hit here with this analysis, is that it doesn't need to blow up in everybody's face. They had two tough games against 2 tough opponents. And I think on the whole, like, the general production is close to being there. So maybe against a team like Atlanta that's not as good, Desmond Ritter's not as good, the offensive line's not as good, whatever it may be, you get that final product that everyone's been hoping for, and they get there. They kind of get back on track. So
who's going to get more sacks on Sunday, Craig, Atlanta or Washington?
Ooh, that's a good question. My guess, based off how the year has gone, is Atlanta. That's, which I don't like, on some level doesn't make any sense, because I think, like, Washington's D line is obviously better. Atlanta's offensive line is better, so I guess in that way it's great. But, like, Atlanta's pass rush unit, I mean, Logan, I don't even feel like we talked about it that much yesterday when we did our preview show. Like, they're not like they have any elite rushers.
They're one of the worst groups in the NFL at generating pressure with 4. So
yeah, like Grady Jarrett inside is kind of a mess. Eric can be a mess for your offense, but, like, he's a nose tackle. So can you just double him all the time and kind of take care of that way? Like, that's one of the easier positions to take care of from a pass rush standpoint. So, but I don't trust. Yeah, this is my one gripe with the way the offense has gone this year. And it's more specific than they've taken too many sacks. I do not think that Eric has adjusted to calling plays for Sam Howell compared to Patrick Mahomes. And the stat that I was like beating, Logan, I don't think I've said it in a week, so I'm going to go back to it. This stat's a couple of weeks old at this point, but I have to check the new numbers. But, like, there's a stat, Ron would be like, I looked at the analytics. This would be on his analytics sheet of pressure to sack ratio. How often when you're pressured do you actually get sacked as a quarterback? And for Howell, through, I think it was 3 weeks, he was at 39%, which was far and away the worst in the league. Mahomes was at 2.6%. The best in the league. So if those are the 2 QBs you're calling for, you got to realize that pressures are way more damaging for you with the new guy than they were the old guy. And that means you're probably going to want to run it more. You've got to, by design, get the ball out of his hand, screens, quick game, things like that a little bit more often, on top of realizing he's a young player. You're going to have to coach him up and he'll get better at that stuff. So I think while Eric figures that out, like, to go back to your original question, Atlanta's going to have more because Sam's going to be exposed a few too many times. And once we see Eric kind of flip that switch and find it, which is getting a little bit better each week, then I'd feel better saying that Chase Young and Montez Sweat and John Allen, Deron Payne are probably going to wind up with more sacks than the other D-line most weeks.
Yeah, and I was gonna push back on that a little bit, but I think Craig kind of saved his butt there a little bit by kind of putting that modifier on it. What I was gonna say is that I think when you look at the Philly game, that's what EB did. He did a good job of running the football more quick game, more screens, more kind of that 3-step, 5-step stuff. Sam understanding when the situation when the ball needs to get out of his hands. So I do think there has been a little bit of growth. There's been a growth for sure. And I do think obviously, so what about the Bears game? They threw the ball 55 consecutive times. I just point to game flow. And I think the one thing about this game flow against the Atlanta Falcons, it's going to be huge, is the Falcons want a more deliberate game flow. So if that's what we're doing, then we can be, or the Commanders can be, more deliberate with their game flow. Like we can be okay. I think the one thing that I would have to call attention to is that the problem in some of these situations is you're in a more deliberate game flow, you get less opportunities to make plays, right? Because the game shortens, you get less possessions. So how do you handle that? And how does that stress the offensive coordinator or not stress the offensive coordinator? I think that'll be really interesting. But in terms of pressures, Matthew Bergeron is starting left guard for them. He's a rookie. I really liked him a lot coming out. But I think John Allen can eat that guy for lunch, right? I think, Storm Norton might play at right tackle. Caleb McGarry's on the injury report. We'll see what happens with that. But if he does play, Montez Sweat has a history of making that guy look like a backup right tackle, which is what he is. So I do think there's a lot of things here that kind of could bode well for the Commanders in terms of pass rush. Now, that being said, this is one of the toughest teams in the NFL to create pressure on, not because of the personnel. It's because of their offensive philosophy and perspective. They run a lot of play action, a lot of keepers. They're doing a lot of misdirection and things that give the pass rusher a false read when getting into the rush. So I think if there is a tell, if there's a way for this group, again, with the offense's help, to shift the game flow, get these guys to throw a little bit more. Like Jake Matthews is a top 12 tackle in the NFL, but he doesn't do well against really good power rushers. And right now, Chase looks like he's on the verge of being a very good power rusher. So those are the matchups you're talking about in the defensive line. The question is can you dictate the game flow and can you dictate Atlanta's offensive production in such a way that allows those guys to win those matchups consistently? Because if Atlanta's in their desired game flow, no way are you going to be able to get any kind of pressure just because of how they call games. Hopefully that answers your question, Doug.
It does, and I want to get back to Sam in a minute because Craig, you brought him up just a minute ago, and all the passing, and I've kind of said the same thing. I wonder sometimes if EB forgets that Mahomes isn't back there. Before we do, I'm curious about Chase coming back. It has been a slow start for Jonathan Allen.
Yeah,
Logan, is that a product of the two of them not gelling well? I mean, sometimes you just work better with some people. I mean, I'm not suggesting that's where we're at here, but it feels noticeable that when Chase comes back, you hear less about Jonathan Allen. I'm not sure whether one has anything to do with the other or not.
Yeah, so I think like with anything, I think it's multifactorial, right? So
it's our favorite on the Take Command podcast. We're a big multifactorial podcast.
We like to live in the gray. It's not a binary thing. So first thing I would say is that group is playing about 15% more snaps per game than they were last year. And I think that is going to be fatiguing long term. I think last year, Coach Z did a great job of making sure that the Casey Tuhels, Ridgeways, Abdul Andersons got in and rotated a little bit more with that group. And I think it kept the main horses fresher. Like last year, Casey and James were getting about, between 15 and 20 snaps a game. And now they're getting between 4 and 7, which is a huge drop off statistically in terms of that number. So I do think fatigue is a big thing. John's the oldest guy on that defensive line. As you get older, you need more R&R. Craig talks about that with strength and conditioning all the time. I talk about that with strength and conditioning all the time. As the athlete gets older, you need to kind of change what you're doing. Now, I think that's a huge factor. But I also think, to your point, Doug, that when Chase has come back, John has not been as confident rushing. And it's because Chase does whatever he wants to do. Now, that is awesome because it leads to a 37.5 pressure rating against the Bears, which is one of the tops in the NFL. Just for some context, Nick Bosa had a 27.5 against the Dallas Cowboys on that Monday night game or Sunday night game, whatever it was. So very, very crazy statistical production from Chase with regards to pressures. But you can see that John is now not throwing the move as hard as he wants to, because he doesn't know what Chase is going to do. And I think when you look at Montez and Payne and the way they rush together, they're more in sync. They're more copacetic, and that allows them to both of them be more effective. So right now, I think Chase is like at 100% efficiency, like maybe 95% efficiency, and and John's at like 50% efficiency. So I think if Chase were to bring that down a little bit, maybe like in the 85, 80, where he's not maybe at his best, but still very effective, you'd see a much more productive John Allen. Because right now, I think John is he's just unsure of where he's supposed to fit. He's trying to play off Chase, and you see it very, very consistently. So I think it's both of those things. I think it's the fatigue. I think that's a big factor. And I think coming off this bye, they're going to look a lot better and a lot fresher and a lot more aggressive, because nice long layoff, get everybody nice and fresh. But also, I think that is something that needs to be communicated and figured out. And I think Chase, if I was going to call him out, this is not just to be like because Chase is playing really well, needs to be a little bit more mature about working with his teammate here and just saying, how do we make both of us get better? And I think that'll be really interesting to watch coming off a bye and over the next couple of weeks of the season. So,
and Craig, am I crazy? It doesn't feel like nearly as many twists and stunts inside and out running. This could be because of injury, but no 5-man fronts like we ran a bunch of that last year. I really thought that was going to be even implemented more this year. The rushing has been fairly basic, it feels like. Craig, am I wrong on that?
I mean, Logan's definitely the better person to ask, but I'm pretty sure I've seen some statistic stuff that they're like one of the top 4 rush teams or 4-man rush teams in the league. They're definitely not bringing a lot of blitz pressure. The one thing I'll add before letting Logan answer that in more full, though, is let's not forget that John Allen missed like the last 2 weeks of the preseason. And that kind of just gets swept under the rug because there was no games. Like, he wasn't going to play in the final preseason game, and then he was ready to go week 1. But he had plantar fasciitis, and 1, that can linger. 2, that means he missed a lot of conditioning. So on that level, like, it's worth mentioning that he's probably, like, even though he's playing, he's probably not 100% for one or both of those factors.
Yeah, and to that, I agree. I think that's a great point there. I also think that, like, with regards to the complexity of the rush, I do think it has gotten a little bit more simplistic. And again, I do think I go back to game flow in some of these games. Like I look at the Denver game where Denver had to pass a ton, very high statistical production, right? But in the other couple games they've been in, Philly's the best O-line in football, right? Not a lot of production there. But I also think that, you got to pick your spots. Like, more stunts does not lead to more pressure, right? More blitzing does not need to put more pressure. Like, finding the correct opportunities to apply those things, that's what we're kind of looking for. And everyone says run more 5-man fronts, and I think Craig and I are both big proponents of that. But also, I think it's important to understand that there's detriments to that. You lose players in coverage. You make yourself more susceptible to the spacing in the back end. And if the spacing is more advantageous to throwing the football, I don't care how good your rush is. The ball's going to get out of the quarterback's hands. So you are kind of walking this line of of kind of finding the most effective way to rush the passer while also finding the most effective way to play coverage. And, there's a lot of ways to do it. But I think, like, that's kind of what I would, if I was the staff, what I would have utilized this buy for is, like, how do we make these groups, how do we maximize in both areas? And when do we want to be more aggressive with the stunts, with the pressures, with the 5-man fronts, and kind of maximize our rush in conjunction with the coverage? Because, again, that's not something, it's hard to do that when you're, like, faces pressed up against the glass. During a little bit of a buy, you can step back and say, okay, look at our third down efficiency. Our third down pressure efficiency is X. How do we maximize this? I think that's what we're looking at.
I also think that if I'm Jack, I don't know how much I trust some of these back end guys to, like, we talk about simulated pressures, for instance.
That's a great point.
Right? Like, and Tevin Jenkins talked about this after the Bears game. He's like, yeah, some of the safety rotations and stuff, like, we saw right through them. We knew exactly what they were going to do. They didn't hide stuff very well. And so if you're Jack and you want to run, like, if you can blitz, which then takes players out of coverage. So that's one option. Like, yeah, nope, we're coming. Here we are. But you can also simulate pressure and try to draw a slide to one side and then bring pressure off the other. Like, all these things that are more complex. But you have to then, like, if you're in the A gap, for instance, as a middle linebacker, and you're simulating pressure, but the coverage in the back end is actually some form of Tampa 2, meaning you've got deep middle responsibility. Like, Jamin Davis is fast, but can you time it right so that you can chase potentially a slot wide receiver through the middle of the field if that blitz gets picked up and there's not some giant gap in the middle, open middle of the field. Like, these are the kinds of questions that you're starting to ask of your players, and they're really difficult. Like, there's a reason teams don't do this stuff all the time. It's because it's complex, and by nature, it puts you out of position because you're faking something and then going to something else. And so if you don't trust your safeties and your linebackers to drop to the right places, for instance, you can't really run simulated pressures. And so these are the types of challenges that you're facing. You still have to figure out solutions. It's not to let them off the hook, but like, and obviously that's not the case in every single situation. But like, again, these are the types of things. It's not as simple as just run simulated pressure, run a blitz. Like, every decision you make has a sequence of consequences that follow, and you have to decide which mix and match of decisions is going to create the best outcomes for you. And they obviously have not figured that out yet because the point production does not lie.
And now with Forrest out and Butler in, how big of a loss, how big of a change is that, Logan?
Forrest has been playing okay. I don't think he's been playing as well as he was last year. I think he's a good player. I think he's a guy you can count on, to Craig's point. And I think the staff is really excited about Percy. I think Percy is a young player who's very physically gifted, who, much like Emmanuel Forbes, is going to experience some up and downs. And like Craig was talking about, like I was talking with someone in the building, and they kind of making reference to some of the details that some of these young players got to own a little bit more. Nothing mean or malicious. It's a fact, right? They got to be a little bit more detailed with their alignment, their assignment, their execution. But I think, if as a fan of the team, I'm excited for Percy to get more opportunity. I don't know how it's going to go exactly, but I think he's a guy with more physical upside and a guy that has a competitiveness to the way he plays that gets me excited for what that looks like when he's in all the time with more opportunity. And Forrest has the same thing. So as much as I'm sad that Forrest is hurt, I just think there's an opportunity here for a young guy to kind of say, hey, like, let's make it go. Now, is it going to be the cleanest, prettiest thing all the time? No, but do I hope that he grows up and makes plays and develops in this defense? Yes. And I'm hoping the same thing for Forbes and some of these other young football players you're going to be counting on. Quan, I think, is another one that I'm really interested to see what he does with an expanded role. And again, I want to see physically gifted, athletic football players, guys who love the game. Say what you want about what they're to put on the field. Like, you talk to Percy, you talk to Quan, you talk to Forbes for 5 minutes, and you immediately understand how important football is to them. And in my experience, you bet on those guys, because the more they play, the more experience they have, the better they're going to be. And part of the issue there is you got to take your lumps with them. So there are going to be lumps, but hopefully they're going to be fewer and far between as the season goes on, and the defense is better for facing this adversity now.
Why does the team feel so comfortable moving St. Juice into the slot? I don't. I'm not the coach. They know more than I do. I won't try to say that I do, but it feels like they continue trying to force him into the middle of the field, and every time they're forced to put him back outside, he looks much better. Problem is, I guess they have 3 boundary corners, and you're trying to figure out who's going to the nickel. But that was their fault for drafting a boundary corner in the first round, right?
Well, that finger point, Logan, was a bingo, not a, hey, you answer it. The problem is that they have 3 outside corners and they have no slot guy.
That's why they had to draft
as their best position, right?
Yeah, everyone calm down, because
St. Juice has actually played pretty well in the slot.
Okay, there we go. All right, go ahead now. Yeah. Craig, continue with your thoughts.
But is his highest and best use in the slot? Probably not. But I think this year he's been better than he was in that position previously.
He's been great. Like, he's been of the back end guys, the most consistent, and that's in terms of my visual observations. That's in terms of PFF grade. Like, he's been the most consistent coverage guy for them. Now, little bit of a modifier there, because not everyone's been super consistent, but yeah, I think it's important to note wherever he's playing, he's been doing a pretty good job, outside of the explosive play he gave up last to the Bears a couple weeks ago, whatever.
Right. Hey, he only gave up 1 explosive play to the Bears. That puts him top of the list. Yeah. I mean, I think that what it speaks to, Doug, though, is like the larger questions about the roster decisions that they made, and specifically their first 2 picks. Like, they drafted a boundary corner or an outside corner when they already had 2, and they drafted a backup safety at a position where they had 4 dudes that were ahead of him on the depth chart. Like, if Jeremy Reeves did not also get hurt last week, he's probably playing ahead of Quan Martin this week.
Yeah, right.
That's nuts. And the funny thing is these two things mesh together because when they drafted Quan Martin, Logan and I were like, all right, there's your new nickel corner. Turns out that's not your new nickel corner. They're playing him as a safety. So I think this is kind of a larger issue of like resource allocation. And this is, again, a different podcast that we will probably wind up doing this offseason and did to an extent this past offseason. And I've certainly done many radio segments on it recently because I think it's coming to a head where you have certain positions where you wish you maybe would have invested some more resources and they're not as good or as deep as you wanted. And you have other positions where you've got these prime resources, whether it's free agent money spent or high draft picks, and those guys are not contributing at all or not very much. And that is not a great way to build a roster. And it is definitely coming to a head in that where you've got surplus in some areas and deficits in others. And it's not good math. That math ain't mathin'.
To your point, this is an interesting thing too, because I was talking to maybe with Sean King over the offseason about how rosters are built and offensive versus defensive minded head coaches. And he brought up the time when he was at Tampa Bay and he said, when Tony Dungy was there, all of our resources were put into the defense. And as soon as
Gruden.
Who is it?
It's John Gruden.
Gruden comes. All of a sudden, you see all the resources start being put into the offense.
We got to get some guys over here on the offensive side of the ball.
It's always interesting to see how the rosters are built. I agree with you. We'll use this as a segue into the offensive line, which I assume you were referencing there in some form about where the resources were spent. Logan, I guess somewhere in between the numbers and the film is the right answer. PFF likes the offensive line much more than the fan base does. Where in does the lie for the offensive line?
So, I'm kind of with Craig. I kind of wish they would have made some bigger, free agent moves or bigger moves in the draft for offensive linemen. And when you talk to people in the building, they said, oh, the guys we wanted were picked. And that's kind of why the draft is a crapshoot. And I think I had a lot of concerns about the group, but I do think that they are playing, this is going to sound insane, but I think they're playing pretty good. It's not like they're playing well enough to win. Let's just say that. I think that's what it comes down to. It's like, are they the best O-line in football? No. Are they top 15? Maybe. And I think that's kind of where they're at. They're probably like right smack dab in the middle. And I think one of the things I would just recommend to fans is go watch other offensive lines. Go watch how they play on a down in and down out basis. And when you watch a lot of offensive lines, you realize that like O-lines give up a ton of pressure. Like Kansas City's offensive line, if you watch a Thursday night game, it's every play is a pressure. It's the quarterback does an excellent job of elevating and getting the ball out. So I do think that sack number is definitely correlated to having a young player at the quarterback position, like Craig alluded to. And I think you are going to have guys who are physically limited in certain situations because you don't have a Trent Williams out there, and they're going to get beat by better pass rushers. The good thing about this group is I feel like they limit those bad losses to maybe 2 or 3 a game, which is well within kind of the median average for NFL. So as much as people want like to crush the O-line, I think PFF is kind of right on. Like when you look at the offensive lines, they're always kind of in the green or the light blue. And that's kind of what it looks like. I think Cosme's playing good football. I think Gates is playing good football. I think Sadiq is playing good football. Good for him, right? Leno's kind of Mr. Consistent, steady Eddie, kind of grading right around that 70, 75 range. I think that's right. He's going to have a couple losses in a game. Like that's who he is. He's a mid-level left tackle, but he's still a good football player. And I think Wiley, when you watch him run block, when you watch him in the screen game, when you watch some of the other stuff he does for the offense, it's very valuable. But again, he's going to have 2 or 3 bad losses in a game, and that's who he is. And I think like they are playing consistently enough as a group to help you win football games. And I think I just say, look at the New York Giants offensive line, watch a second of that group, and you realize how much better this group is than them, right? It's like not even in the same ballpark.
They're missing Andrew Thomas, to be fair.
Yeah, they're missing Andrew Thomas, but
they're also missing a lot of blocks.
Yeah. Yeah, but I'm saying like that group is basically it's a non-tenable offensive line. And I think this group gets put into that bucket because people see the sack numbers, but when you watch the down-to-down play, it's like this is winning football from the offensive line. Is it elite? No, but are they not the Philadelphia Eagles? They're not them. but they're a good middle of the pack, kind of second or third tier offensive line in the NFL. And that's good enough to win football games, which is, I know people don't want to hear that, but that's what the film says. That's what the grades say. And that's my opinion of how they're playing. Like, it sucks, but that's true. So find a different group to pick on, I guess, would be what I thought.
Right. But this goes to the roster construction thing, right? Is like,
Yeah.
you knew going into the year your quarterback was Sam Howell.
That's a great point.
A guy who has a long history, 3 years at Carolina's worth. And, you've seen it yourself with your own eyes, even in practice when, is he getting the ball out quick enough? Like, that's a thing with him. So if you've got these resources to invest financially because you're not paying a quarterback big money,
right,
and you've got a bunch of really good players at other positions, why are you drafting in the first and second round and the third round guys who aren't going to play for you a ton of snaps? And obviously the plan was for Forbes to do that, but even then, this whole conversation starts because we're talking about how to fit Fuller, St. Juste, and Forbes on the field at the same time. Why aren't you investing free agent money or high draft picks in top flight offensive linemen?
Broderick Jones
if that guy's your
pick before Forbes.
Yeah.
Right. If that's your quarterback, then you kind of need a better than average offensive line. So like, it's not fair to the offensive line to be like they're playing badly. They're not. But the offensive line and the level they're at doesn't fit necessarily with the quarterback and where he's at in his career. Hopefully he's going to continue to grow and hopefully quickly. And I think that's the frustration. Are fans articulating that well? Absolutely not, but that's not their job. Their job is to be mad and listen to shows like this and hopefully ours. But for us, like looking at a more nuanced view of it, that's kind of to me the mismatch here of like, yes, the offensive line, I don't know, this offensive line can play a lot better, but that's a design flaw, not the fault of anybody currently out there.
Yeah, and
does Ron get credit, real quick, Logan? Does Ron get credit for picking guys that may be good that aren't playing now? Like, I mean, it takes some cojones for a man that's got his job on the line to be picking players that they knew weren't going to play this year. Does he get credit if those guys end up being the right picks, or you just had to do something to beef up the roster now?
I think so. I think like if he does end up, if he loses his job or if he moves on to a different position elsewhere, like people always look back, like Jay Gruden does that show with Ben Standing every week, and he does stuff with the Junkies or Grant and Danny, and he's always like, "Oh, that's my guy. I brought him in," and I think there is an element of truth to that. Like it wasn't, and I think that's something fans need to understand is like I think Forbes is going to be a good player. Like he's going to be a good player in the NFL, but it takes time to develop. I think. When you look at Quan, like you're looking at, again, I said this before, you're looking at good competitive football players. I want to bet on those guys. They're going to get better. And it's just going to take a little bit of time. And I think in a couple of years, we'll be like, man, these guys are good ball players helping this team out, but it's not right now. And I think that's probably a little bit of the frustration. I think, to Craig's point, like when you pick a guy in the first round, you expect them to be a little bit more, to have a bigger contribution. And I think that's another reason why this feels a little bit weird at the moment, I would say.
Yeah. Like I have no problem with him bringing in Nick Gates or drafting Ricky Stromberg. I have no idea why the hell you do both.
Right.
Like they're similar enough as players that feels like a duplicate, and to use a third round pick on a Ricky Stromberg after you've already signed a Nick Gates doesn't really make a lot of sense to me.
Yeah. And like to your point, Craig, about the offensive line, and Doug, your point about the offensive line, like, I look at, I've been hate watching Cleveland recently. Their offensive line, because they drafted DeJuan Jones, and I had a very high grade on him, and he was there right around when Washington was picking. But basically, you talk about investing and kind of picking players to fill gaps. They've invested a ton of money in that O-line. They've invested a ton of draft capital, and they have a quarterback who has a very high sack rate, who's not taking a lot of sacks. And I would look at that and say, he's still holding the football the same amount of time. What's the difference between here and Houston? And he's playing behind one of the best offensive lines in football. And I think, Craig, to your point, Doug, to your point, maybe that's kind of what they should have been thinking about a little bit more. Like, look at Jalen Hurts. That's another great example. He holds the football longer than anybody. Like, he's got one of the longest times to throw in the NFL. He doesn't take a lot of sacks, and it's not because of him. It's because the offensive line's excellent. Yeah. So maybe your point that they could have done something different there, Craig.
One more before we get to kind of the predictions for the Falcons game. And I'm curious both your thoughts on this. They have, Craig, you kind of alluded to this earlier. They have thrown the quarterback into the fire and are not holding back the playbook. From what I can tell, they have given him the reins and said, go do it, kid. Now there is you certainly can be from the standpoint they should be running the ball and limiting his exposure. But I've also talked to a bunch of folk from that used to play that say, listen, I like getting in there and playing. Give me the workload and we'll figure it out. There's nothing better than experience and reps. Where do you sit on this notion that they've basically just given them the playbook and said, go do it, kid?
I mean, I agree with the notion, and if you want to phrase it that way. What I have a problem with is when sometimes Rivera is like, well, he's got to get out there and take these reps to learn. It's like, I would like a game plan every week in the NFL, no matter who my quarterback is, to be designed to win the football game. And what's the best way to do that? And with Sam Howell, it's not handing the ball off every time, but it is probably handing the ball off a little bit more. Like, how do you design a game plan? And sometimes, like, to be very clear, sometimes I think Ron just says stuff. I actually don't always believe fully. Like, does he mean what he says? Not all the time. And Eric says a lot of stuff that actually, when you go back and listen to it again and look at the transcript, you're like, wow, he spoke for 2 minutes and didn't say a damn thing. So there's some of that going on here in terms of the narrative. But like, if they're calling some extra pass plays because they want to get Sam some extra reps, that's dumb. Go win the game. And I think a combination of obviously some drop back passing that they're not afraid to give him is great because I think he's good enough to do it. I think obviously play action is something that's probably been underused a little bit. And this is all with the benefit of hindsight and me sitting in front of a microphone and not being on a headset during the game while the play clock is going. Like that is, and Logan can talk about that even at the high school level, how different that is versus the ability to rewind the tape a bunch and be like, yeah, I wish we'd have done that there.
Yeah.
Running the football a little bit more. So I think the screen game's been underutilized. They're good at it. They've got great guys to execute as ball catchers and ultimately carriers. So there's all of that. But I would just like to see a game plan and be confident that that game plan was designed to win the football game at hand as opposed to quote unquote developing Sam Howell. Because you know how you develop? You stay out there, you win football games, and you earn yourself more reps over time versus we got to squeeze 3 extra pass plays into this week. And I don't know how much that is happening, but I do think that they could probably insulate him a little bit more, and that would actually be better for him in the long term, as well as helping the team.
Yeah, and I'd probably push back a little bit on the notion that the whole offense is in for him. I think they're running an offense that's aggressive and pass forward, but I don't think I don't think he's doing a lot of stuff with protections. I don't think they're doing as much motion as they want. I don't think they're doing as much like variety in terms of formational variability. Like I think there's a lot of stuff that's still in the bag. And I would say if you are questioning that, just watch anything Kansas City has done for the last 10 years. And it does not look like this. This is much more simplistic. It's much more watered down. I think that's a reflection of having a young guy at the position. And that's not an indictment of Sam. Like it's just you've got to like the whole notion of delivering a play in the huddle is insane to me. Someone is literally barking in your ear. You're trying to regurgitate it while thinking about your reads and who's got to know the correct information. And then you get up there and you say, oh, I got emotion on this play. Let's make sure that goes. And he's got to get set. And then then we got another shift afterwards or whatever. So I think it's a little bit watered down, a little bit neutered. And I do think they are presenting him kind of these stagnant looks that help him find good matchups. And so to me, this is like, I don't want to say it's quarterback with training wheels because it is complicated. It's nuanced. It's challenging, but it's a little bit more simplistic than I think EB ultimately would want. Like if you said EB, perfect world, what does your game plan look like? It would be, I think, something more akin to what they're running in Kansas City right now. And if you watch Kansas City, it's very complicated pre-snap. There's a lot of different formations, and that's not quite been what they're doing here. So I think, again, I think this is part of the developmental process. Are they throwing the ball a lot? Yeah, but it's 2023 in the NFL. You're going to throw the football a lot, more than you are going to run the ball.
The one thing you said I'm real curious about, Logan, I'm sorry to cut you off, but I wanted, before we moved on, or your next question, you mentioned the motion, and my understanding is that helps the quarterback. Does it make it harder for him pre-snap? Why aren't they doing motion every play then?
Some people some people hate it, like some people don't like it. Cause so for example, let's just take my high school quarterback, great kid. I wanted to do a lot of motion, help him undress the coverage, help find matchups, whatever we're going to do. It's easier for him to stand back there in the gun and say, there's 2 guys over here. There's 4 guys over here. I'm going to throw to the 2-on-2 side. That's what I'm going to do. And he can just see that if I'm motioning, the coverage structure can become a little amorphous, right? And you see that with guys like Aaron Rodgers, who I don't want motion. I want stagnant pictures. I want to find my best matchups. And I think there is a little bit of that going on here too. So it's a preference thing. It's a comfortability thing, 100%. And I think there is a little bit of motion to kind of help, but it's very simple motion. It's like, hey, we're going to take the back, we're going to motion them to the backfield. And that gives you a tell in terms of man zone read, whatever it may be, but you're not seeing this, we're not in tight bunches. We're not in like these condensed formations. We're not running guys back and forth across the formation in the way you see in Kansas City. And I think a little bit of it's because, like, hey, man, we want you to see what we're looking at, see the throws, feel comfortable with what you're looking at, and make the best decision. So I think that's that to your point, and I haven't talked to Sam about it. That's just an assumption, having talked and dealt with, like, even Matt Ryan, he was on our podcast. He said, like, he didn't really dig when Kyle came in and it was all this tight stuff, play action, turn your back to the defense. Like, everyone thinks that helps young quarterbacks, and it does simplify coverage structure, but it also, there are, like with anything, there's challenges to it that make it more difficult to be an effective passer.
No, I appreciate that. That's why I wanted to ask, because I think most fans hear motion dictates coverage. Why not run it every time? And that's a great explanation as to why maybe you don't run motion.
Yeah, because it changes. I mean, a lot of teams have automatic checks.
Great point.
Great point. Let's say you have a 2x2, and I'm going to dip into a Logan here, but you got a 2x2, right? So you got 2 receivers on one side, and one of them might be a tight end, whatever. 2 on one side, 2 on the other. And when you motion one to the other side, now you have a 3x1. Or let's say you even started 3x1, you motion over, and now you got 4 and 0. A lot of times, if you have that many on one side, it's an automatic check for the defense. So the quarterback is not going to see that if they can communicate it quickly and that it's, motion set hut, right? They don't ever actually get a picture of what that new coverage structure looks like pre-snap versus let me sit back in the gun. And this is also why a lot of quarterbacks, and especially like a guy like Sam, talk about gun versus under center, like shorter guy, you can see better from the gun. Like sometimes it's that simple, right? Pre-snap, I can see where are the safeties. Am my middle field closed, middle field open? Are they aligned in a way that tips zone? Are they aligned in a way that tips man? Like, you can see all of it. And even if they are disguising, you can see it cleanly versus a bunch of guys in motion. It's really muddy. And that's when those tight formations and stuff come in too, because you're always going to try to disguise it a little bit. So everybody's in tight. Now everyone's moving out into space. And it's like, what the hell are they even running? Right. So it becomes very complicated very quickly. But for quarterbacks that can see through that stuff, that's when the motion becomes super helpful, because you can make it complicated for the defense while your guys know what they're doing. But the key part of that is your guys know what they're doing.
I didn't even realize we're almost up on an hour here. So let's get some quick score predictions, or at least what you think the game's going to look like, and we'll get up out of here. Logan, let's start with you.
Yeah, for me, the more I've watched the film of Atlanta, the more I think it's going to be like a 1 or 2 point game. It's going to be a really, really tight game. I think this is a well-coached Atlanta Falcons team. I think they're physical. I think they're tough. I think the Commanders are coming off an embarrassing loss, and I think they are going to be ready and raring to go. Like, this is going to be a kind of a bloody nose style game, put your mouthpiece in, buckle the chin strap type deal. And so I'm thinking it's going to be like 21-20, like that kind of score. It's going to be a few, like, you're only going to get 5 or 6 possessions in this game. You got to make them count. Who can make each possession count the most effectively? Who can stop the run in terms of what the Commanders are doing? But it's going to be a tough physical outing for sure.
Is there a difference, real quick before we get to Craig, is there a difference? I noticed, like, at least for this year's Commanders, when they're on the road, it's like suit and tie, business, very formal. At home, it's T-shirts and pants. I know this is a very silly thing to bring up, but it's different, and I'm curious why.
Yeah, I think a little bit of it is because of how you get to the game. Like, when you're traveling with the team, you're on the team plane. Usually have a dress code for the team plane. For the home games, you're at the hotel, the team hotel. You're like right down the street. So it's like, hey, get up, come in. We're not traveling together on a team bus. We're not traveling together as a group. So dress as you would as an individual, show up as an individual, and we'll play the game. And I'm not, that's not a bad thing. I've been a lot of places where that's what you do. You come in, I drive my little Ford Escape into the parking lot, got my, gym shorts and t-shirt on, and I walk into the stadium, and no one takes a picture of me. No one cares. Right. Cause I'm like coming to my house. Right. So I think that's kind of what I would say about that.
Logan did not ever make GQ Sports during his career.
I did not. No.
Sadly.
Craig, what does it look like for you on Sunday?
Yeah, I'm thinking something similar. I do think Washington can do this. Obviously they can. Like I think they will do this. Like 21-19, which I know is the same exact score that Atlanta won by last week, which is a weird NFL score, but I don't know. That's what I got in my head.
19.
21-19. I don't know how they're getting a 19, but 21-19.
Yeah.
I don't know. 2-point conversion missed at some point. Made. I don't know. Missed extra
Yeah.
point. I hope not. Young Wei Koo is
But-
my fantasy kicker, so no missed extra points.
But close. It's gonna be a close game though.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
And in part because of the game flow, right? Like these are not teams that theoretically, I mean, we probably would have said this about the Bears, whoopsies. But these are not teams that are looking, at least in Atlanta's case, to like run away with it. The game flow should be tight,
Well, they also don't
all that
have
kind of
like
stuff.
to that point, they don't have the same type of explosive
Yeah.
firepower. The receivers are good. Drake London, Matt Collins.
As long as Bijan doesn't do anything crazy. Which,
Correct.
knock
Like-
on wood.
and also Cordell Patterson's getting back in the lineup, so there's your explosive element there. But
And they got Kyle Pitts, and you know what tight ends like to do on this defense.
yeah, and he's gonna have a good game. But like again, he's gonna like the last game. I think he was 7 for 85, which is a very
Yeah.
productive stat line. But you don't get. It's not 3 for 120, right? There's no and 2 touchdowns. There's not those explosive. They don't have those explosive guys that can run away from you the same way that the Bears did. I will say there's one concerning point for me is the Bears seem to have figured it out the week before.
Yeah.
And it seems like Atlanta kind of figured it out. So like, do they have an offensive identity now? Do they have a flow? Is Ritter playing better? It'll be really interesting, but I hope they win this game. I think they are capable of winning this game. It's not going to be an easy win though. I think is the thing I want to drive home here. If they do win, it's going to be a tough game. So
Fellas, we appreciate you. Craig, what's the schedule look like for the Take Command podcast?
So we will do somewhere around 8:15, probably a post-game show on Sunday night. But no matter what, we'll have something up Monday morning, our instant reaction show. The film review podcast comes out Wednesday mornings, and then our preview show is Fridays. And then we do a little mini pod called Take 5 in between, where we go a little bit deeper on, say, one of the plays in the game, or like the Thursday shows we've been doing story time. So you get a fun story from Logan's time in Atlanta, for instance, this week. So just kind of week by week, we pick our favorite stories from the opponent's city, and my time covering the team, Logan's time playing.
Who came up with the name for the podcast?
I think the corporate folks
Someone
gave us
did,
Take
yeah.
Command, because I think at the time, like the team was trying to use that as like their hashtag, and we're like, well, you don't have a trademark on it, so we should probably take advantage of the Take Command thing. I think Take 5 was my idea. I think
Yeah, it
I
was
did
your
it
idea.
like just kind of spontaneously.
What's the over-under podcast with the name Command in it now?
oh god, there's like
Many.
a million of them. I got 2. We got the Command Center podcast that I do. Like they're all. It's like any way we can get the word command in it, like commanding baking lunch. There we go. It's just like it's crazy the segments now.
If they change the name again, we're all just. I'm curious to see what the fight over the next word. It'll depend on what happens, but that'll be fun. You're good. The Big Douglas Show.
Yeah,
Doesn't
Big
matter
Doug
what the team
is-
name is.
We're good. That's right.
You're all set.
I'm good to go. Fellas, I appreciate this. Was great. It was. I could have done it for another hour. So I appreciate you guys for sure.
Appreciate it, Doug.
Thanks,
you, man.
Doug. Appreciate it.
All right, man.